بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Respected elders, brothers in Islam. So we're on the 14th week of this course, basically the second last week. Alhamdulillah, it's been a long course, but inshallah it's been of some benefit. And today we're going to be discussing more common questions that you're going to get asked, more objections that people raise against Islam or just religion as a whole. We're going to be discussing a few of these in depth. So again, it's not going to be a continuous session because we're going to have different objections, and the different objections are not necessarily linked to one another. So because of that, it might seem a bit discontinuous, but that's the only way to do it. And inshallah, next week's session is going to be the final one. We're going to be talking about how to explain Islam, how to best articulate the message of Islam to someone who has no idea what Islam is. But for now, let's go on with the common questions. So an overview of what we're going to be talking about in today's session is, number one, the problem of evil. So the fact that evil exists in the world, the fact that there's pain and suffering, and this is one of the major objections of atheists against Islam and against all religions, that they use as an excuse for why they don't accept the existence of a God. So we're going to be talking about that. Then we're going to go a little bit more in depth, or we're going to be talking about Islamic inheritance. Many people say, why does the woman inherit half of the man, etc. It's a common objection. So we're going to be discussing that. Is it true? Is that even the case? They're making the objection. We're going to ask them for the proof for that. Then we're going to be talking about the verse of the Quran where it says وَضْرِبُوهُنْ, where literally if you translate it, it could mean that the man has the right to physically harm his wife. So a very common objection as well. We're going to examine that verse, see what the Mufassirin are saying, see what's the correct understanding of that verse. Then quickly we're going to just talk about jihad in Islam. I think that's a much simpler to answer. We'll just spend a little bit of time on that. And also just a little bit of time on how a Muslim state treats non-Muslim citizens. So like we living here in a non-Muslim country as Muslim minorities, we have certain rights. Alhamdulillah, we have quite a lot of rights. But in the empires of the past, in the Islamic empires of the past, if were those who ruled according to Sharia, what rights did they give non-Muslims? Because non-Muslims like to say that if they lived in an Islamic country, they would be oppressed. But is that true? Is that not true? So we're going to just look at that in brief. And then the last part is we're going to look at 2 or 3 alleged errors, na'udhu billah, in the Quran that people like to bring up. They say, see, there's an error here, there's an error here. There's only about 3 or 4 very famous ones that they bring up. So we're going to just look at that. So inshallah, this will be our common questions part 2. Now let's start with the problem of evil. So what exactly is the problem of evil? It can be understood in many different ways. For some people on a lower level, it's just that they might see their example, and I witnessed this with a family member. He saw our grandfather being robbed and brutally hurt, and and it was difficult, right? So the question came to his mind, and he was a youngster at that time. He's saying, well, how come Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed our grandfather to go through this when he's such a good person, he's such a nice person? Why did this bad thing happen to him? So it can be articulated on a very on a very primal level in that sense. But also on a more philosophical level, the way this is phrased is that the atheist will ask you, if God is all powerful, so he'll talk about the suffering in the world, and he'll say, if God is all powerful and he can stop the suffering, but he doesn't stop it, that means he's not all loving, because why isn't he stopping it? Right? So that'll be the first thing. Or they'll say, maybe he is all loving, but he can't stop the suffering, that means he's not all powerful. Right? So that's how they're going to phrase the objection, and this is known as the problem of evil. And this is how it's phrased in a philosophical context. But now, and this is a line of thought that I want us to use whenever an objection comes up. What we can do now is, okay, they made this objection, let's try and answer it. But the first thing you have to do is question the assumption that this objection is based upon. So don't always accept the objection. For example, someone will say, slavery in Islam, which we spoke about, is bad. How come Islam allows slavery? So we'll try, but you have to now don't just accept the objection. Why is slavery bad? It can't be such that we're always on the back foot. We're always answering. They have to give proof for their objection. They can't just simply say, oh, Islam allows this, therefore it is bad, we all accept it. They have to also prove why it is bad. So here also, when we look at the so-called conundrum, they say if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all loving, then he would have stopped the evil. But do we even as Muslims believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is completely loving in the sense that no bad can happen to anyone? No, there's also the sifa of adl, justice. So when justice is measured with love, then sometimes if someone did something wrong, you have to show him punishment. So this already in the assumption of the objection, there is a problem. That they're assuming that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only has the sifa of love. But what about the sifa of justice? So they're forgetting about that. What about all of the other wise things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to accomplish? So don't ever accept the objection on face value. Always question the assumptions that are that underlie these objections. So that's what I'd start off with. Now, how do we as Muslims answer this? So I'm going to start off with the last point on the slide, that this question is dealt with in the Quran. That if we see in Surah Baqarah, right in the beginning of the Quran, the angels ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, why are you going to put man on this earth when he's going to cause bloodshed, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to cause all of this here. So the angels are asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they see Adam alayhi salam, and they say the humans are going to go on earth, and there's going to be so much of suffering, there's going to be so much of bloodshed, there's going to be so much of evil. And we worship you. The angels are telling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are the ones, we worship you, we don't do any of that. So we want to know, why are you creating Adam? So what are they asking? They're asking, despite the fact that there's going to be evil, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have you created Adam alayhi salam? And this is the problem of evil that they're talking about. So the Quran deals with all of these issues, it touches on all of them, and it points you in the right direction. And what answer did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give? And the answer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gave in the Quran, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them, see, I know everything. I know things you don't know. The meaning, what does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wise purposes for why He did something. And we can never always understand the wise purpose. So that answer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to us in the Quran is going to form the foundation and the basis of our answers. So when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of His attributes is that He is wise. He does things for wise purposes. So we as Muslims believe that whatever is taking place in the world, there's a reason for it. We might not be able to see, sometimes we can see the reason. Maybe in our life, like for example, a person, he was going down a bad path. He was sinning, he was doing a lot of wrong things, and then he got extremely sick. And after that he came back, he was performing his 5 daily salah, things came right with him. So there we can say, hey, Allah's wisdom, Allah made him get sick, all of the suffering, but it was worth it, he came right. So there we could see it. But it's not always that we can see it, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom is far above anything that we can understand. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wise. Everything that occurs in this world, there's a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing it, which we don't have access to as yet. Now think about examples in our life of beings that have much less intelligence. You have a child, he wants to go touch the stove. Now he's a young child, he doesn't know anything. You might hit him now, because every time you're not there, he's going to touch the stove. And how do you get them? You're going to hit him and tell him, don't do it. Now in his mind, from his perspective, look at this person, my father is being bad to me, he's causing me suffering. But there's a wise purpose behind it that he can never understand at this point in time. But maybe he'll understand it at some other point in time. Or even the same happens to those people who have dogs as pets. They'll sometimes, in order to train the dog, they'll hit it. They won't let it get things that it wants. Why? Because they have a wise purpose. The dog can never ever understand that. Now our intellect and our understanding in comparison to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can never be compared. So how can we claim to understand the wise purposes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for certain things happening in the world? So that basically is the answer, and that answer is derived directly from the Quran. But there's many other ways that we're going to answer it. So you can ask the person that, don't you also for your child, for wise purposes, you subject him to suffering. So what do we mean by that? When he's born, for some people, they'll give him his vaccinations. Or if he's sick, they'll give him an injection. Painful injection you're going to give a small child. But why? Because there's a wise outcome. Because he's sick. You give him the vaccine, you give him the injection, or you give him the injection. If he's sick, he's going to get better in the future. But he has to suffer, he has to go through pain. But there's a reason for it at the end of it. Think about a girl when she's small and she wants to wear earrings when she's bigger. So what they do, they pierce the ears. Such a painful process. You're going to make that small child, that girl, pierce her ear. What a painful process it is. But why? Because you have some sort of goal at the end that she's going to wear earrings when she's bigger. So I'm saying these are examples to show that whoever is asking this question, you also yourself cause pain to beings less than you for wiser purposes. There's no one who can say they don't do that. So this is something and you think about it, if you have a son, you make him go through hardship sometimes. Why? So he becomes a stronger man. You put him through hardship, you test him, so he becomes a better person. So all of this is part and parcel of life. We ourselves are doing it. And think about it also, if you want to build a house somewhere, a new house, how many thousands of insects do you kill to build that house? Don't you kill to build that house? So sometimes many times people use the problem of evil as a scapegoat. They don't want to believe in God for whatever reason. So they say, but how could God kill all of those people? Babies are dying, children are suffering, etc., etc. Not realizing that they themselves are doing the exact same thing throughout their entire life. All right? Now think about this, and I've heard atheists discussing this, that they felt that why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create the world when there was going to be so much of suffering? Meanwhile, they themselves will get married, have a child, knowing that that child, when he grows up, he's going to get sick, knowing that that child is going to go through hardship, knowing that that child one day is going to die, and it's going to be a difficult death most of the time, yet they'll still bring a child into the world. They won't think to themselves, but this child is going to go through so much. I'd rather not have any children, because if I do bring him, there's going to be suffering. Let me just have nothing at all. But yet they expect, when they think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they say, why didn't he just not create any creation so there'll be no suffering? But on a micro level, they're doing the exact same thing when they decide to have children. So sometimes it's a very short-sighted way of thinking. So that's one way that we go about answering this, is that every person allows pain to an extent to get wise purposes. The second very important point we make is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put us into this world to test us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the ability to do certain things. And mankind goes about hurting other people. In order for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us complete free will, He has to give us the ability to harm someone if we want. Otherwise, if we weren't allowed to do that, then we'd really have no free will. So in order to enact this test in this world, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us this gift of free will, which some people then use to harm other people. So also understanding that. So if we are going to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shouldn't have done any of this, then we're limiting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power to test us. Because in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala testing us, He gives us free will, which some human beings then use to hurt others and cause pain and suffering in the world. Now this is a case study, so I want you to imagine this and you tell me what outcome you're going to give of this. I heard this some time back. So imagine you're flying in a helicopter, right? You're flying over a beautiful jungle, or like a nice ecosystem there. You can see the beautiful animals, you can see the jungle, you can see the plants, you can see this whole ecosystem, and it looks amazing. There's a waterfall, everything looks so beautiful, right? All of the animals and all of that. But you also know that as beautiful as all of this is, there are animals killing one another in there, there's things dying, there's plants getting trampled on, there's insects doing all of this. So this amazing thing that you're witnessing as you're flying over it, if someone gave you the choice and said, see here, you got, there's a button here, if you press this button, this entire beautiful sight will disappear. There will be no more pain. It'll disappear, and all the pain and suffering that's there will be gone. Or do you want this beautiful life to exist in front of you? And very, very few people will be hard pressed to say, no, just take away all the beauty in the world around us. So sometimes we don't understand that, in order for and this is the next point we're going to come to, in order for there to be beauty, good understanding in life, there also has to be the knowledge of what is evil and what is pain. And that's the next point that we're going to talk about now. Okay, that's first. Before that, we also speak about every single person who does go through hardship and he's a believer, he will be recompensed in Jannah and Jahannam. So it's not like the suffering you go through in this world is just going to be like that. Think of, and this is a very amazing hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that on the day through Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam informed us that on the day of Qiyamah, that person who had nothing in this world, that person who had the worst life in this world, nothing was going for him in this world, but he was a believer. On the day of Qiyamah, he's going to come in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put him into Jannah for 1 second. So his entire life, 50, 60, 70 years, he was suffering, but he had Iman. And he comes on the day of Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَيُصْبَغُ فِي الْجَنَّةِ صَبْغَةً, puts him into Jannah for 1 second and takes him out. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks him, did you ever experience anything bad in your entire existence? After that 1 second of being in Jannah, this person will say, I honestly cannot recall anything bad happening to me in my entire existence. So can you imagine that yes, there is a lot of suffering in this world, but that one moment in Jannah will remove all of that from this person's consciousness, so to speak. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also speaks, in that hadith, it speaks about the other person who he had the best life in this world. Everything was going for him. He had houses, he had cars, he had women. But he wasn't a believer. So when he comes on the day of Qiyamah, he'll be put into Jahannam for 1 second. He'll just be put into Jahannam and taken out. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask him, your entire life, did you enjoy anything in your whole life? And he'll say, I can't remember enjoying anything in my entire life because he went into Jahannam for 1 second. So that's the point of that hadith. But here we can understand that all of the suffering that goes through in this world, that we go through in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recompense us for it on the day of Qiyamah in Jannah. So just remember that. And now the point we were talking about, could you know good without bad? So if you never experienced hunger, would you be able to experience that satisfaction of eating a nice meal if you never got hungry? If you were never in danger, could you really appreciate safety and being secure if you didn't know what danger was? Could you really understand what pleasure is if there was no pain in your life? Right? Or think about it like this. What's some of the most virtuous values that a human being can have? Courage, forgiveness, determination. How can these values be manifested if there's no evil in the world? How can you have courage if there was nothing that you were scared of? How can you forgive someone if they didn't do something wrong to you? How can you have determination unless there was a hard situation that you had to endure? So the most beautiful things in the human being are manifested when there are evils and difficulties around him. And the beauty of this world is experienced in contrast to the evil and the bad things that are there. So that's something also to understand. That there's so many wisdoms, we're just talking about a few of them. There's so many wisdoms in all of these things that it's far beyond our imagination. So everything goes back to that answer. And the last thing that we're going to mention here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sovereign. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yaf'alu ma yasha. He does whatever He wants. We can't judge Him by this standard saying why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created evil here, why He did this, why He did that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the King. He's the greatest. If He wants to destroy us now, He can destroy us. It's nothing. For Him. It's not going to affect Him. يَفْعَلُ مَا يَشَاءُ. He does whatever He wants to do. So that's how we close off the argument. That at the end of the day, we have no right to say, every single thing that exists is within the dominion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a person like us, in our dominion, we can do whatever we want. Similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do whatever He wants in this universe, and no one can question Him, no one can take Him to task, no one can ask Him why this or why that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is King at the end of the day. So that's how we package and frame this entire answer about the problem of evil. We start talking about wisdom, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being wise, and then from there we go on talking about how some of the wisdoms in the creation of evil and suffering, that it brings to light so many virtues, and also that people will be recompensed in heaven and hell. And lastly, we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing whatever He wants. And this is the point that also we'd want to make to an atheist. That you have your moral system of judging what's right or wrong. But the point here is, at the end of the day, we're discussing with the atheist, we're discussing whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists or not. That's the discussion we're having with him. Not whether you agree with this or that, it's whether He exists or not. That's the discussion we're going to have with the atheist. So this is something that they generally use to sidetrack, so it's just something to keep in mind when you're having that discussion. Now again, we're going to change topics completely and move on to another subject. If there are questions on the previous subject, we can take it. But if not, we're going to carry on moving like this. The second one is Islamic inheritance prejudiced? So the ayat of the Quran says, وَلِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. Right? That's just one ayat. You know the ayat of inheritance in the Quran, all fast, very difficult to remember. There, one of the sentences says that for the male will have the share of 2 females. Right? Now, the obvious objection comes now from those people who are not Muslims. The Islamic inheritance system is unfair. Why are the males inheriting twice of the females? To the double of the. Now again, what was the first thing you do is question the assumption. So I want this person now, he got that one verse of Quran or that one part. So I'll ask the person, why? What's your proof that males inherited twice the amount of females? So he'll quote that verse. So I'll ask him, does that verse apply across the board, or is it only in a specific situation? And when we see now, it's actually only a specific situation. So we must never accept the objection. The objection is not even true in the first place. As we're going to see now, there's many more cases where the woman inherits more than the man. But people don't know that because we're so busy trying to justify why the man gets twice the share of the female. And we have a right when we can justify that because there are legitimate reasons. But we forget that the objection is incorrect because there's more situations where the female inherits more than the man. But we don't realize that. So we're going to look at some of these situations. Now, the Islamic inheritance system is so much more complex and beautiful than just gender. Gender itself doesn't just determine shares like that. So here we can explain to them that, see, what determines generally, from what we can understand, your share. So how close you are to a deceased. So the husband and the daughter will get more than the husband. For example, if you look at it, this year has nothing to do with male or female. Because the daughter is considered to be close, more in need, she's going to get half. The husband is only going to get a quarter of the share. So because the daughter is judged to be more close and in need, or there's the children, they will get more than the spouse regardless of gender. So the first determining factor is not gender. The second determining factor is also not gender. The second determining factor, or one of them, is whether you're in the younger generation or the older generation. That's also what we're talking about here. So the grandchildren generally will inherit more than the grandmother or father. Why? Because they need the money, because they're going to be living for a longer period of time. They've got the entire life ahead of them. So they generally might need that more, as opposed to the grandmother or grandfather. Now again, these are just wisdoms we're talking about. The actual laws are stipulated by Quran and Hadith. They decide what the laws are. But when we look at it, we can see so many wisdoms, so many reasons for people getting more than others that have nothing to do with gender. And the third reason, which will give you more share or less of a share, is financial responsibility. So we know that in a household, who bears the financial responsibility? The man. The husband has to look after the wife. The wife doesn't have to look after the husband. The husband has to provide a house, has to provide clothing, has to provide food, has to give her spending. Similarly, for his other relatives who are female, he has to provide for them. That's another determining factor which will decide who gets more between the man and the woman. So here I took this from one of the fatwa on the internet. They say the wisdom behind this arrangement is as follows. The male is responsible for the financial upkeep of his wife and children, whereas his sister's financial upkeep is the responsibility of an individual other than herself, such as a husband or father. So if you have two children, right? They're children of this man. You have a son, you have a daughter. Now they're going to inherit. So in that's the situation, and also brothers and sisters, where the male gets twice the amount of the female. The son will get twice. Why? Because he has to look after his wife, he has to look after his children. The daughter will get half of the man because her husband's going to look after her, or her brother, her same brother has to look after her as well if there's no husband. So obviously it makes perfect sense that's going to be the case. Right? But again, we said, even though we have this answer which makes perfect sense, don't accept the objection, because that applies here for children, it applies for brothers and sisters, but it doesn't apply across the board for grandmothers, grandfathers. Grandmothers, in many occasions, inherit more than the grandfather, or the grandmother will inherit to the exclusion of the grandfather, as we're going to see the stats just now. So what we want to try and get across here is income is not equal to wealth. What that means is, wealth is determined by, well, the way they're explaining it here is, your income that you're getting minus all of your expenditure gives you your wealth. So the husband, or the man in this case, the son, might get a lot more there, but he has to also take into account all of his expenditure, and then you can look at his wealth. The daughter might inherit less, but she has no expenses, so her wealth will be equal to, or maybe sometimes even more than the son. So there's no real disparity between the two. I don't want to go too much in depth. We're looking at all of the different cases because it takes a lot of time. But basically, here's the facts that we need to know. There are only 4 cases where a male inherits double the share of a female. Now remember how many possible cases you get, possibly I think 70 or to 100 cases. There's only 4 cases where a male inherits double the share of a female. There are many cases where a female inherits a share equal to that of a male. There are more than 10 cases where a woman inherits more than that of a male. And there are cases where a woman inherits a share, but her equivalent male counterpart inherits nothing in that situation. Now, inshallah, I'll try and share with you because they got the detailed case for each one, but that's going to take like pages and pages. But this is basically the sum of the stats here. That is, the objection itself is completely incorrect. It's based on a misconception of the Islamic inheritance system. It's a much more complex and vast system than just to be able to say the man inherits double the female. That's only in 4 cases. That's the brother, the sister, and the son and the daughter. In all of the other cases, there's completely different things going on. Why? Depending on your financial responsibility, depending on how close you are to the deceased, depending on a whole lot of other factors. Now here we can just go on to other related gender issues, maybe if also some discussion we can have here. So does Islam view men and women as equal? Now this was a question that never ever really came up before, but it's a question that now you're always going to get. Does Islam really view men and women as equal? Now, in order to answer this question, there's 2 ways you can go, but the one I like, if someone that's a non-Muslim is asking you, is to say there's a difference between being equal and being the same. So you can have equality, but it doesn't mean you're exactly the same, identical. Because Islam agrees and accepts and enforces it upon you that men and women are not identical. They have a lot of differences between them. This physical, look at all of the scientific studies, you can just Google it. The physical disparity between men and women is undeniable. There's no one that can deny that, right? So men and women are not identical, but Islam treats them equally with respect to the akhirah. Because what's the most important thing for us as Muslims, as believers, is the akhirah. With respect to the akhirah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a few places in the Quran mentions that person who does good deeds, whether he be a male or a female, whether he be a male or a female. So with respect to the akhirah, men and women are equal. In fact, for a woman, if she just obeys her husband, does her fara'id, hadith says she's going to Jannah. So the equality here is complete equality with respect to the akhirah. And at the same time, they are not the same according to Islam. And this is a standard, if you go by science as well, they tell you that they're not the same. So that's a general answer that we give there. Then they also ask, why are there gender roles in Islam? Because remember, in the West, there's no such thing as gender roles. When you get married, the man must work, the woman must also work, the man must take care of the children, the woman only pregnancy because they can't do that yet, so the woman will do the pregnancy. But otherwise, everyone's sharing in the responsibility. But in Islam, there's a structure in the family. The man, الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ, as we're going to talk about, that the men are the maintainers of the woman. The men have the responsibility. And when you have the responsibility, you also have rights that come with it. With rights come responsibilities. So you have to look after the woman, but you also make the decision in the household. The woman will generally, if she doesn't have to work, she can stay at home, she can do whatever she needs to from the house, look after the children. That's her responsibility. That's how, if you think about it, any company, how does it function? Different people have different roles. Not everyone is a CEO. In one company, how many people are the CEO? One person. The other people are, one person is the secretary, one person is doing the work on the ground. There's different positions for everyone. Not everyone goes to one position. People understand this in every facet of life, but because of this gender equality thing, now people don't understand. The family is the same. There's someone who's in charge. There's someone who's better at this. Women are much better at taking care of children than men. No one can deny that. And men are more suited to going out and earning money. Yes, in today's time, the jobs have become much softer, but put yourself, 300 years into the past. Think about how difficult most of the jobs were, how physically demanding most of the jobs were 300-400 years ago. Women could never have carried them out. So that's why you didn't have those movements going on back then. But now, because jobs are much easier on the computer, these kind of things, women can to an extent handle them. But Islam is universal. Islam is giving you a principle that's going to apply across the ages. The family structure is such that the man is in charge, he will be the breadwinner, the woman will generally look after the children. And there's a lot of wisdom behind this. It allows children to have a mother always there with them, guiding them. It allows them to have a father who's a true role model, and it keeps the structure of the family, which is very, very important. Another gender-related question, why do women have to cover up? And this is a very famous question. Why do women have to cover their hair, have to dress modestly, all of this here? We don't understand that. So, I don't know, now I've just been seeing a few answers that seem to be working well, where they ask the person, okay, will you allow a woman to walk naked on the street? Can everyone walk naked? They'll say, no, they can't walk. Obviously, they can't walk naked. So then you ask the person, okay, so what must they cover? They'll say, no. Maybe some will say they must just cover here. Some will say, they'll all give their own things. So some people, but they all agree that there has to be a dress code. Even in the West, most countries still have a dress code. A woman can't walk completely naked in a lot of the countries. They'll have a minimum dress code, at least here, or it's public indecency. So where did they get that line and distinction and delineation to say, this is okay, this is not okay? Where did they get that? So, because every single human being agrees that there must be a line where this is indecent and this is decent. So Sharia sets it at a certain standard, at a very high standard, and that's our standard. You have a much lower standard, but both, according to you, are subjective. So you can't tell us to follow your standard, and we can't tell you to follow our standard because we believe it comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the easiest way to understand, explain most of these coverings, is that they themselves also agree that there is a minimum limit that must be followed when it comes to covering, when it comes to clothing. So we also believe that. It's just that our limit is different from your limit. So what's the big deal in the two? Why is it difficult to understand that? And the last gender-related issue we're going to look at is, why can only a man give divorce and not a woman? So we had some students from America they came for a tour here in the masjid. There were some theology university students, and then they came here. They were asking a lot of these gender-related questions. And then this was one of the questions one of the guys asked, why the man only is allowed to give divorce, why the woman can't give divorce. Now, the answer that we generally want to give is that Sometimes a woman can get emotionally unstable, especially at certain times of the month. It can happen, and she can basically do certain actions which she will regret later on. And you see it happening. Any person that's married knows that this happens. Sometimes a woman can become overly emotional, irrational, and the entire marriage will be at stake because of that. So that's the answer you want to give. That's the one that makes sense. But sometimes in certain settings you can't give every answer because those people are not going to understand that answer whatsoever. Right? But that is, it's a reality of the situation. That at certain times a woman can become overly emotional and make decisions that are irrational that she regrets the next day or she regrets the next hour even. So that's one of the reasons. But also if you look at the entire, just take a step back, what's happening in marriage? The man has to give mahar to the woman, right? The man generally will take the woman into his house. The man has to see that the woman has food, that she has clothing, that she has spending, that everything is sorted out for her. So if they were equal, they would ask you, but why does the man have to do all of this here? If those people who are asking the question were honest people, they'll ask you, but why the man has to pay the mahar? Why the man has to do upkeep? Why? But they don't ask any of that. They just ask, but why the woman can't give divorce? So you see how it goes on, they just go on one side. So here, it's not, there's so many things that the woman doesn't have to do that the man has to do. So there's this equality that we're seeing here, but it's not the same. They're not the same, but there's equality in the matter. And then also we explain that the woman does have recourse if the husband is abusive. She can go the route of khula, which is where she approaches, like in our country, the jamiyat or something, who can make fasakh of the nikah. So she does have right to recourse. It's not like she's stuck in the marriage forever. That's another thing. And she also, after she does that, there will be her family members who will take care of her. So there's a complete package and a complete answer for this. When someone does ask this question, is that at times women can be very emotional and irrational. Number two is that, men have a lot of obligations upon the woman, and this is one right that they have. So there's equality there. And then also number three, what we're talking about right now, is that the woman does have recourse to talaq, but it's just in a different form called khula. She can't just give it immediately. So in all cases, all rights are upheld. That's something we must always be sure of. Right, now the last topic before the break, it's a very, very sensitive, difficult topic also at times, is the verse of the Quran, which we're talking about, الرِّجَالُ قَوَّامُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاءِ, right? And then as it carries on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those women who you fear. As for those women on whose part you fear disloyalty, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so basically those wives who are disobedient to you, فَعِظُوهُنَّ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you must give them some advice, speak nicely to them, tell them, see, don't do this, start doing this, be nice to them, right? فَعِظُوهُنَّ. Then second step, وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ. Second step is now withhold sexual intercourse, separate beds, basically some physical separation between the two of you to show that, you're unhappy. I told you don't do this, I advised you nicely, we're separating, now I'm showing you, see, you're really upsetting me, right? And the third step, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ. Now this is where all of the objections come in. Because وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ can be translated, and even you'll see here in this translation that I put here, as beat them. And so obviously what's the objection that every non-Muslim is going to say? Islam allows you to beat your wife. That's this whole verse with everything in it, they'll just focus on that one part. Islam allows you to beat your wife, finished. And how do you answer that in front of everyone? It's not an easy thing to answer. It's not beat but not abuse. There's a big, and I'm saying that's what we would like to say. But imagine in the Western world where it's so taboo, although it's happening all the time, but it's so taboo to say you can even lay a hand on your wife. And now to explain to them, as you said now, and as I would want to, that beat and abuse is very different, they're just not going to understand it. And I've seen this with so many people that even if you have this understanding, and you know what you're talking about, but they've been programmed to think in such a way that if you're going to try and tell them, no, beat but not abuse, it's like the whole crowd is going to turn against you. That whole crowd is going to, especially if it's non-Muslims, people you're trying to draw closer to Islam. So sometimes what you said is completely correct. We have to use other ways of explaining the same thing, but just, you're just phrasing it slightly differently, but explaining the exact same thing. Because it's a very touchy topic, and it's always that gotcha question that's asked by non-Muslims. Always, always, always. If they want to make an objection against Islam, this is it. Islam allows wife beating. But let's just put it into context now before we go into the answers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you fear disloyalty from your wife, then فَعِظُوهُنَّ, admonish her. Second step, وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, separate your beds. And third step, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, which we're going to translate and we're going to talk about now, which can be translated as beat. For some reason, most of the translators did translate it as beat. Just a few points to note about this is that when these things are mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, and even the kitabs of the Ahnaf mention, that the order must be upheld in these three. So we're going to talk about what wadribuhun means. Probably it's mostly what you're talking about there, that it's something light like a miswak. But you can't jump to step 3 if you haven't gone through step 1 and 2, which is to, speak nicely, then separate the beds, then after go. So there is tarteeb between the 3 steps, right? Now, another point to also note is that the human condition is such that when there's 2 people in an extremely close relationship and one is stronger than the other, and it's happening across the board, like marriage, everywhere, you're going to get cases where they fight, and you're going to get cases where there's abuse. That's why even though the law in all of these countries in the West is that you're not allowed to abuse your wife, more than 1/3 of women have been physically abused. More than one. So the law is fine. Okay, according to them, the law is fine. Don't do it. But what's happening? It's being done, and the actual amount is much higher than 1 in 3. 1 in 3 is the reported cases that they're getting, or people who are admitting to it is much higher than that. So I'm not saying again that we should do that, but I'm saying this is a point to note, that Islam sees something that can happen and doesn't give you some unrealistic thing that makes no sense, that just don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't do slavery. Don't do any of these things. It will regulate it in the right way. So that's what we're talking about here, right? But we're going to explain what it means. Then again, another thing to note is, in the West, it's fine to verbally, like you can psychologically abuse your wife, completely insult her, do all of these things, nothing will happen to you. But sometimes that abuse is far more harmful to a person than 1 or 2 slaps. Think about it, 1 or 2 slaps, you forgot about it. But someone really insulted you, made you feel small, from the time, keeps breaking your self-esteem, that will damage you for years and you can never forget about it. So remember, Islam doesn't allow both of those, anything that's damaging, and we're going to talk about that now. Whereas in the West, it's like you can't lay a hand on your wife, but if you're if you're a mentally manipulator and do all of those things, what are they going to do about it? Because it's only on the level of government that they can control you. There's no moral control on the ground. Now, 2 tafsirs for this verse, for وَضْرِبُوهُنْ, what does it mean? So what does daraba really mean? Now we need to understand the spectrum of the word daraba. So when you're making tayammum, if you don't have wuzu, you're making tayammum, and then the kitabs of fiqh mention whether after you do that, how many darabat there must be on the sand. So that action of you touching your hand there is called daraba also. But it's not like a darab. When you're making tayammum, you don't like smack something. It's just like a light touch, right? But daraba also means to beat, on the other hand. So there's this huge spectrum of meaning in this one word. And then there's many other examples of where daraba, it doesn't mean like, it has no connotation of beating, but it does have the connotation of just touching like that. So there is that usage, right? Now, let's apply that usage to hadith. Many times when Sahaba had some sort of misgiving or like, Ubay bin Ka'b, when he wanted to understand Sabatu Ahruf, he was a bit confused. He came to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he was confused. He's saying, Nabi sallam, I have certain doubts. Nabi sallallahu daraba his chest. Nabi sallallahu hit him like that. He didn't physically abuse him. He did this to him, and with that motion, like it removed the doubts that were in his. And we see that happening many times with Sahaba. When they had an issue, they weren't understanding something, Nabi sallallahu would do that to them, and it would like remove that. Nabi sallallahu wasn't physically abusing them or beating them, but that same word is used over there. And other times also in other ahadith where there was like an altercation between 2 Sahaba taking place, daraba will also be used. So it has this very wide connotation that people are not realizing. Now the first tafsir of daraba is that you've done the steps now, and you separated the beds, and this woman is still not listening to you. Now, as a way of being stern, of telling her that, the next step after this is going to be divorce now, because that's where we're headed here. You take something, they say a miswak in some of the tafsirs, or you were talking about straw as well, and you basically, it's a sign of showing that, I'm really angry, and after this year it's over, it's finished. And it's not beating the person. It's not trying to physically harm them. The goal of the thing is not to hurt the person, but basically to reprimand and make zajar of the person. That's the goal of this whole thing. And that's what all of the Mufassirin mentioned. That's the goal in this whole thing. It's not to physically harm the person. It never was. And from here, you take out a beautiful point that it's understood already that the relationship between a husband and wife has to be such that there's no physical abuse, such that when you get to this third step, that one small amount of physical contact will be enough to shock the wife. Because if your relationship was already going to be one of abuse or physical contact, then this third step of doing that will have no meaning to you. It'll mean nothing because you're doing that all the time. So it's exhibiting to you how this only happens in a rare last case scenario, but the rest of your relationship needs to be completely free from that. So that's the way it actually needs to be looked at. That's how many of the Mufassirin understood it. And we see this in the life of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And I haven't seen many people mentioning this, but if you read Sahih Muslim itself, right? Aisha radiallahu anha says that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam never hit anyone, not a slave, not a woman, never hit anyone except if he was in jihad, then obviously he was fighting in jihad. Aisha radiallahu anha herself says this, right? But if you look at another incident in Sahih Muslim, Aisha radiallahu anha follows Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and because she wants to see where he's going, and then when he turns to come back, Aisha then runs, comes to the bed, jumps in the blanket, but Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam comes back and he can see that she's breathing heavily. So he asks her, what's happening here? Why? Then he realizes that she followed him. So now he gets upset because, why don't you trust me? Do you think I'm going to betray your trust? And so what word is used there? Daraba. He did daraba to her at that, or he ghamaza, and she said she even felt some pain. But the thing was, she was the same person who said Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam never hit anyone. So there's a great difference between beating someone up and this, where you just reprimanding and rebuking them, and you can see this being enacted in the life of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. With these two incidents in Sahih Muslim, where Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam reprimands Aisha radiallahu anha with a little bit of physicality, but when it comes to Aisha radiallahu anha talking about Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, she says that he never ever hit anyone, not a servant, not a woman, no one, except if he was in jihad. Now the second tafsir I'm going to mention here is mostly mentioned by later Mufassirin. If you read Ibn Ashur in his tafsir, he speaks about, and many contemporary scholars talk about this, they talk about it referring, they say that the disobedience we're talking about here is zina, that the woman is committing adultery or fornication. And the ruling for someone who does this is that they have to be lashed, or they have to get some sort of punishment from the government. So وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ doesn't refer to the husband having autonomy, it refers to him referring them to the state who will then enact the punishment on her. It's a tafsir, it's not a very well accepted tafsir, but it is a tafsir that is there, which doesn't refer to the husband, and it takes disobedience to refer to fornication and adultery. So that is another tafsir that is there. We're going to just talk about jihad in Islam, because again, for some reason that's a taboo concept. People say that, Islam sanctions the killing of innocent people, jihad, attacking, taking over lands, all of these things. And again, sometimes as Muslims, we go on the back foot. We say, no, Islam doesn't sanction. Jihad just means to struggle against yourself. It doesn't mean to go on war. It doesn't mean to kill anyone. Some people say that. Why? Because they get put on the back foot to such an extent that they just want to appease the person who's asking the question. But what we said again from the beginning, when anyone asks or makes an objection, you have to question the assumption that what is your objection? Your objection is that Islam allows you to have an army. Almost every country in the world, besides one or two, have an army. Islam allows you to defend yourself militarily. That's every country in the world allows that. So again, don't just accept the objection, try to remove jihad, take it out, because the verses of jihad in the Quran are clear, very, very, very clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many cases commanded the Muslims to fight against the disbelievers, but there was a reason for it. It wasn't just out of the blue. No Muslim is allowed to just go and start killing someone. All of those verses have a context. Now, to go into each verse and each context, again, it's not within the purview of our session here today. But all of those verses have a context, and we're going to just mention one or two important verses so we understand. Now, it's true that jihad, in the word jihad, from mujahada in Arabic, just means to struggle, unrestricted. Whether it's physical struggle, whether it's mental struggle, emotional, spiritual, struggling against your nafs, all of those fall under jihad. And sometimes in the Quran, the word jihad is used in the meaning of struggling against yourself, making sure you do good deeds. That usage is found in the Quran, there's no doubt about that. But that's not the only usage. Islam implemented warfare within certain parameters, and there's no need to shy away from that. That is there, it makes sense. Again, it's the human condition, humans are going to fight, Muslims have the right to defend themselves, jihad is there. So it's nothing to shy away from. Now the next thing we need to understand is having an army is a necessity. especially in the time when Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was living, in order to survive in that world. And even today, to a great extent, an army is necessary. At that time, empires expanded, they contracted, they were just fighting with one another non-stop. For Islam to survive and spread in the world, there had to be an army. There's no other way that you can ever imagine it. There had to be a force behind it. So now Islam came and regulated that warfare. If you look at what was happening around that time, or even after that, people who weren't Muslims, nations who weren't Muslims, when they went into warfare, they conquered a place, they would just brutally massacre the people there. They would rape the woman. They would do all sorts of horrible things. Islam came and said, okay, you've got a right to defend yourself, you're going to fight, but if you defeat someone, you can't do those things. You're not allowed to kill women, you're not allowed to kill children, you're not allowed to burn places of worship. All of these things which other empires were doing without restraint. They were doing these things at that time. Islam came and said, yes, warfare is necessary, but do it in this way, do it in this way, don't do this, don't do this. So it came and regulated it. And we find again that this is a common theme in Islam. Whatever it is, Islam came, didn't try and eliminate something that can't be eliminated. You can't eliminate warfare from the lives of humans. There's never been a time in history where there was just no fighting. That's a necessary condition, it's going to happen. But what you do, what Islam comes and does, regulates it. It's gonna happen, but do it like this, do it the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants it. Now, in Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, most of the jihad that was fought was, in a sense, defensive. And we see that the first verse generally Mufassirin speak about for jihad is Udhina lilladhina, that those people who have been wronged in the past have been given permission now to fight. So you can see that clearly it's those people in Makkah, they suffered so much, they were driven out of their homeland. Because you've been oppressed now, you've been given permission to, now retaliate against the enemy. And this retaliation doesn't mean, now this is where the confusion comes, this retaliation doesn't mean you sit there and only when they attack you, you defend yourself. No, it doesn't mean that. It means you got two states here, one existing next to the other. You know they're plotting to attack you. So what you do, you raid their caravans, you weaken them, you keep holding them back. So in a sense, that line between offensive and defensive jihad gets blurred. Because the best defense is an offense. I know if you've heard that saying. The best defense is an offense. So you want to defend yourself against them, but the worst thing you can do is just wait till they attack and then defend. You've got to take active steps. Therefore, you'll find Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quraysh will have caravans going past. Nabi sallallahu will attack those caravans, get information, because they are now the enemy, and you know you're going to meet in great battles, and it happened in Badr, etc. So take advantage of them the whole time. Don't be proactive. Don't be reactive. So it's many Muslims say that no, you know what, they make this mistake. Jihad was purely defensive in the sense that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam only waited till someone attacked him, then he attacked him. That's false. But it was defensive in the sense that these offensive missions were needed to defend Islam. So they were offensive missions, but they were needed to defend, in order to defend Islam. That's a very slight, fine line between the two that you have to understand. That it may have been no one was attacking them. They went and attacked. But they didn't attack they attacked because in doing that, they'll weaken them, and by weakening them, they'll protect themselves much better. They'll be defending themselves. So understand that relationship between offensive and defensive is not like it's a barrier between the two. The two merge a lot of the time. Now, after the lifetime of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Islam spread, destroyed the Persian Empire, broke down the Roman Empire. It's inconceivable and impossible to say that they went and took over those entire areas purely defensively. Purely defensively, only when people attacked them, then they took over. People attacked them, then they took over. That didn't happen. But these two empires were a threat to the Muslim nation, number one. So they had to be dealt with. And number two, also, this is one of the most effective ways that Islam spread in the world. And then that's what we're going to get to now. So the rules of warfare, we spoke about this. No one was forced to convert. La ikraha fi din. There is no one who was forced to convert. Yes, in Islamic history, there were certain occasions where people who didn't follow Islamic law made people forcefully converted them, but what they did was wrong. We don't accept that. It happened once or twice. It did happen in history, right? Women and children could not be harmed. Places of worship of other religions could not be destroyed. Now, if America can go around the world spreading democracy here, there, and everywhere, why are we ashamed that Islam spread through the world like this? Islam didn't go and kill innocents. Islam didn't go and force anyone to convert. But Islam spread the message. And if Islam brings justice, if you as a Muslim truly believe that when the Islamic law is implemented in a country, it brings justice, then you should be only too happy when Islamic law takes over another country. Because justice is going to be there for the citizens there, and it's the best for their best interest in this world and the hereafter. So again, there's no reason to get so apologetic about this. They never infringed on the rights of anyone. They never, and we're going to talk about this just now, the jizya and all of those things. They never, massacred anyone. They never raped anyone. They gave them freedom to do what they want. But yes, Islamic law will prevail. The law of Allah will prevail. And again, sometimes too much on the defensive. So we let people who live in America, who dropped the atomic bombs and killed, they wiped out 2 cities. We let them tell us about jihad is moral or not moral. But whereas they are, how does that even make sense? So in these cases, don't go on the back foot. There's no reason to go on the back foot. Ever. It doesn't make sense. And it's a sign of weakness in a lot of cases like this. In talking about jihad, the next topic that comes about is, okay, so you saying that you're not oppressing anyone, but when you spreading Islam, when Islam spread and it went to a new land, they offered the people 3 choices basically. Either you accept Islam if you want, if you don't want to accept Islam, no problem, you pay us the jizya or you fight us. So they say that's what you did was wrong. You're forcing them to pay a tax to you in order for them to carry on living as they were. That's how the objective is framed. That you are forcing these people to pay jizya to you. That's immoral. You're taking advantage of them. Why are you doing this? So they talk about the jizya here. Now we need to understand that any minority or any people that were living within an empire were paying some sort of tax. Which country? Today it's so easy to understand which person is not paying tax. Some of us are trying to avoid it, but people are paying the taxes. So the jizya is not any more, any less than that. There's no citizen today who says, no, I don't pay taxes. And even more in the look at the Islamic system of jizya, that when you take over the land and they're paying you the jizya, you are responsible now for their protection. You will protect them from all outside threats. They don't have to fight in the army. So the Muslims will fight in the army. They don't have to fight, so they're paying for that. And if you look at it, and when you really compare the amount that they're paying, sometimes it's helpful to do this because they are not paying zakat, obviously, and the Muslims are paying zakat. So it's helpful to compare the price range between the two. It's almost exactly the same. There's no real, yes, it fluctuates because zakat is a constant 2.5%, and the Hanafi madhab, there's like brackets for the jizya, but it's almost exactly the same thing. And the Muslims are paying the zakat, they are fighting, you are here, you are safe. The Muslims are going to protect you from outside. And remember, at that time, the threat of outside forces was a huge thing. To be promised protection from the threat of outside forces by another empire who's willing to let you practice freely was a great gift. That's why we see many Jews wanted to be ruled by Islam. And when Islam was spreading throughout the Roman Empire, there were multiple occasions where the minorities that the Roman Empire was ruling came to the Muslims and said, please take over this land. Because they knew the Muslims are going to give them their rights, they're going to allow them to live freely, they're not going to tax them any more than they were going to be taxed. So it's important also to remember those historical occasions where people who were living under the Roman Empire literally came to the Muslims and said, take over this land for us, take over this land, we'll help you, do it like this, take over the land. So they wanted to. Because again, the ability to be protected in an environment like that by a stronger power who's going to let you do what you want was like, the best deal you could ever ask for. Sometimes we don't look at it like that. But that's how a lot of them were viewing it. So in exchange, we said, for paying the jizya, they can practice their religion freely. Even if they're Christians, they could drink alcohol in their spaces. They could eat pork in their spaces. They could have their own courts for things that were between them. That's more of a right than a secular country like South Africa will give you today. If there's a dispute in South Africa today, you as a Muslim cannot rule your own law. The courts, you'll have to follow the secular law. If there's a dispute that takes place, especially in marriage, especially. You can't. So it's even more of a right than what secular countries offer to the minorities living within them. This was offered generally in the Abbasid dynasty. You see this being employed. So sometimes also we don't realize that fact. We're not saying obviously that complete freedom is the best thing, because there were certain things that they wouldn't have been allowed to do. They wouldn't have been allowed to take their thing into like the Muslim spaces and do that amongst Muslim spaces. But they were given spaces where they could be as they needed to be. To an extent more than what's found today in what's known as the free or liberal West, even more than that. So now we get on to the last section, and we were almost finished here, is now the alleged errors in the Quran. Right, so there's only 3 that I have here. I know this slide is actually more for me than you guys. I'm just going to talk about the verse. So we know in the Quran, multiple places, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He created the heavens and the earth and all that is between it, fi sittati ayyam. Multiple places. I think at least more than 7 or 8 places, fi sittati ayyam, 6 days. So it's like you're reading the Quran, throughout the Quran, this fact is being thrown at you, 6 days, 6 days, 6 days, 6 days, right? Now in the 24th parah, Surah 41, verse 9 to 12, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains in detail about the creation. Now again, the word days there doesn't mean 24 hours, that's understood, it's just talking about periods of time. Now let's read these verses here in the Quran, and we can see where the objection comes in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, and He says, قُلْ إِنَّكُمْ لَتَكْفُرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, are you going to really disbelieve in that one who created the earth in 2 days? So normally throughout the rest of the Quran, Allah just says He created the heavens, the earth, everything is between it in 6 days. So it's just a round figure telling you how long it took. Now in this one particular verse, some detail is coming in here. So Allah says, how are you going to attribute, make polytheism with someone who created the earth in 2 days? That is the Lord of the world. ذَلِكَ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Then He speaks about, He placed on the earth firmly set mountains over its surface. He blessed it. He determined its sustenance in 4 days. So created the earth in 2 days, right? That was the first verse. Then did everything, put the mountains and determined the sustenance of the world. That was 4 days. And then if we go a little bit down, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and He completed them as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went to the skies and completed them فَقَضَاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ فِي يَوْمَيْنِ, in 2 days. So in total, that's 8 days. 2 days the world was created, 4 days everything on the earth was perfected, and 2 days the skies were made into 7 heavens. Alright? So now if someone here who's just being maybe blatantly obtuse will tell you, oh, so that's 2 plus 4 plus 2, so that's 8 days, and everywhere else in the Quran it says fi sittati ayyam, fi sittati ayyam, fi sittati ayyam, is contradiction. Right? Let me just give you like an example. Let's just say you had a property and you were building on your property, and you were building a house, and then you were building like maybe a granny flat at the back. So someone asked you, so you built it, someone asked you how long it took. You say, no, the house took about 6 months and the granny flat took about 4 months. Does that mean that the entire project took 10 months? No, it doesn't. What if both were being constructed simultaneously? What if the house started for about 2 months, then the granny flat started like that, and so it could have taken 6 months. So there's nothing in this verse that tells you it was 2, then 4, then 2. And this is another rule that I'm going to mention in the Quran in other places where it talks about بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ and ثُمَّ. Whenever the word ثُمَّ is used, and there's a verb coming after it, or there's an action coming after it, this ثُمَّ here is not for tartib of time. This happened, then this happened. It's for tartib of the sense to show you azama, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did this, then on top of that He even did that, then over and above that He even did that. So thumma, when it comes with the verb, the asal for it, if you read Ibn Ashur, is not for tartib. Is to show that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He did this, then He also did this, then even above all of that He did that. That's how thumma and ba'da dhalika is used in a siyaq of azama, in a context of praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is used like that. Obviously in this verse we don't have that, but in other places of the Quran you see thumma ba'da dhalika dahaha, etc. You need to know that knowledge of the Arabic language. That the thumma and the ba'da dhalik, when it comes with af'al, when it comes with the verbs, it's not used for tartib, it's not used for sequence. It's used to show like greatness in rank, that you did this and then you did an even greater thing and an even greater thing. That's the actual original use of thumma and ba'da dhalik when it comes after verbs. I'm just mentioning that. So here it's clearly not talking about 2, and the verse doesn't even say that, and then 4 and then 2. There's nothing in this verse that suggests that they were taking place one after the other. No, they were simultaneous, and together the totality of all of this was 6 days. Right? Now at this point a Christian might say, but when you point out a contradiction in the Bible and we try and make an interpretation, you tell us, but why are you going and doing this here? Why you don't just take it literally? Now it's actually a little bit of a valid question, Now what's the answer to it? The answer to that is, we'll show you a contradiction in Matthew where he contradicted John. Those 2 authors didn't know one another. They never claimed to be inspired by God. 2 different authors writing about a similar incident that they heard from someone else. The most natural thing to think is that they made a mistake. This is one book that claims to be from God. Quran itself clearly says that there is no mistakes in the Quran. It's one author who himself is saying 6 days multiple times throughout the Quran. Obviously, when he gives you that explanation, it's going to be in line with that. So you can see the huge difference between the 2. The natural assumption, even for someone who doesn't believe in Islam, his natural assumption should be that they're going to be in line. Whereas the natural assumption for 2 separate authors who are contradicting one another is they had different facts coming to them. So that's just an important point to mention there. Now another very, very famous one, the story of Dhul Qarnayn in Surah Kahf, the great king Dhul Qarnayn. He's traveling and he finds the sun, and this is a very famous objection. The Quran says that the sun sets in a muddy puddle. If you're on the internet, you'll see that everywhere. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَدَهَا تَغْرُبُ فِي عَيْنٍ حَمِيَةٍ. So Dhul Qarnayn was traveling, he went westward as far as possible, and then he sees, the Quran says, وَجَدَهَا تَغْرُبْ, he finds the sun setting into a lake or a body of water that was either hot or it was murky, depending on the qira'ah that you're using there. Now, again, if we just, I don't even have to give you an explanation of this. If you go to the beach and you see the sun setting, it looks, to your observation, it looks like it's setting in the ocean. That's what the Quran is talking about. And that's why the earlier Mufassirin never even tried to interpret this, because they never saw an objection with this. No earlier Mufassir read this and said, oh, the Quran is telling us that the sun actually sets inside water, because it was that obvious to them. Whereas here, because people are making this objection now, we have to try and say, no. It's plainly obvious when you're reading the verse that it's telling you he came to what he thought was the end of the world on that side, and he sees the sun setting, and it's obviously setting into this lake, but not literally going into the lake. So that's literally it. That's the entire answer. There's nothing more than that here. It's that simple. But now, we're just going a bit further. There's a hadith on the topic. Now this hadith needs some explanation, where Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam asks Abu Dharr, and this comes in Bukhari and I think in Muslim as well, that when Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the sun was setting, he was with Abu Dharr radiallahu anh, and he says, do you know where the sun goes at the time of sunset? Because they're both watching the sun and the sun is setting. So Nabi sallallahu is asking Abu Dharr, do you know where the sun goes when the sun sets? So Abu Dharr says, Allah wa Rasul alam. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his Nabi, they know best. So Nabi sallallahu answers and tells him, when it goes and prostrates beneath the throne, then it asks for permission to rise, and permission is given to it. And then Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam talks about the end of time when the sun will rise from the west, right? But now this is now some people who are a little bit more research will bring this hadith as well. So the ayat is like so plain that I can't even give an explanation to it. But here they'll say, see, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam told Abu Dharr that when the sun sets, it goes to prostrate beneath the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't know that the sun is always, na'udhu billah, didn't know that, the sun is always somewhere at some point. Now even if we just, let's grant them that, if you just read the Quran on a very literalistic meaning, what understanding do you get? That the throne is right at the top, I'm talking about very literally, then the seven heavens, then the earth. So even if we accept their very literalistic understanding, if the sun was setting, it will be going further away from the arsh, not closer to the arsh. It wouldn't even make sense on that very literalistic understanding. Therefore, we clearly understand that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is talking metaphorically. Now you're going to say, oh, okay, metaphorically, you're just saying that because it's a contradiction. But just read Quran. وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about what? The grass and the plants, or the stars and the plants, depending how you're interpreting that word, prostrating. Where you ever saw, well, we didn't see, but Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam happened. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about all of the trees, all of the stars. They're prostrating before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where you didn't see, we're watching trees in my backyard, every now and then are prostrating. Because Quran is talking about a metaphorical prostration. Even in other verses, أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَسْجُدُ لَهُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ وَالنُّجُومُ وَالْجِبَالُ وَالشَّجَرُ وَالدَّوَابُ. All of these things are prostrating towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The mountains, the stars, the sun, the animals, all of the animals. You never saw an animal making sajda. What is it referring to? So this is not now what happens is, see, you get a false interpretation where a contradiction comes and you make up some metaphorical thing, right? That we don't accept. This is not that. This is a well-established principle in Quran. Quran is telling you in multiple places, the animals, the mountains, the trees, all of them make sajda to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everyone, when we're reading that verse, we know it's not talking about a literal sajda. It means, as the Mufassirin explained, they are in complete obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here, or they are, so in that sense, they are prostrating because whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands is happening. And here, with the same thing, when the sun is prostrating, it's not that it's literally going to make like a sajda or something. And Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is explaining to Abu Dharr that even when you don't see the sun, it's still completely in the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there you see how these ayat line up with the hadith here. That what is the explanation? What is it? That even when you don't see the sun, you don't see it moving as Allah, like you see it in the day, it's moving as Allah commanded it. Even when you can't see it, it's still doing the exact same thing and still moving with the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very simple explanation, but that's if you bring the full context of Quran and hadith into play. Then it becomes a very simple explanation. If not, and you're just looking at this, it can be something where you might find it difficult. Now the last one, and we're going to stop here, is where does sperm come from, or semen? Why? Because this is also a very famous. These are the three objections, really, because if you look at Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there's no errors, obviously. So even when they're trying their hardest, these are the three that you're only going to talk about. And as you can see, they were so easy to answer. And this third one here as well, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks here in surah number 86, that's was-samai wa-tariq, about the insan is created min ma'in dafiq, from fluid that's gushing forth, min ma'in dafiq. And then after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I got the translation, they were created from a spurting fluid. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says after that, the verse stops there, يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ, that this fluid, that's the most obvious interpretation, comes out from between the backbone and the rib cage. So sulb, in this case here, can mean backbone, it can also mean your loins. So backbone carries on right here till just your coccyx, and loins means the area where you'll basically wear your underwear. That's the area of the loins. So those are the two translations of sulb. I'm just going to the Arabic here. And rib cage, tara'ib means the rib cage. Right. Now people will say, okay, but now the sperm that is used to inseminate, to create people, comes from your testicles, from your testes. And that's not anywhere in that region. Right? So they say contradiction. Right. Now Sapiens Institute, which is run by Muhammad Ijam and Hamza who are here, they got a very lovely detailed answer on this. If you want, just Google Hamza Zotzis and this verse here, and the full explanation is there. And I just got a small summary of the explanation here. So he says there are three interpretations of this verse, all of which are not a contradiction. He says the first is that the fluid that comes out is not sperm itself. The sperm is part of the fluid, which is the semen. And the semen comes from the seminal vesicle, and the seminal vesicle is located around here, which technically is between this area. And another thing we need to understand is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also in the Quran, He talks about a woman when they were taking the bay'ah to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, they mustn't act like they have a child. And the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it, يَفْتَرِينَهُ مِن بَيْنِ أَيْدِيهِنَّ وَأَرْجُلِهِنَّ. So the child, they mustn't fabricate something between their hands and their legs, meaning in their stomach. So when you look at that, it's not obviously meant to be in the middle of the hands and the legs in this exact center. It's talking about in that general area, that's where the child will be. Why I'm bringing that up is because when these verses are used like that, it's just a way of speaking. It's not like it has to necessarily be in between. So if you take it to be semen, and there's a picture here, you can see the seminal vesicle is there, and it falls below the end of the backbone, the coccyx, which is there. So it is in between, it is in that area. Obviously the sperm comes from the testes, which is here. Right, so that's the one. The other interpretation you find from the Mufassirin, it's a bit of a lesser interpretation, is يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ refers to the child. That's another interpretation, that the man was created min ma'in dafiq, full stop, and the child now, يَخْرُجُ, comes out مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ, because he's stored there and he comes out from there. So that's another interpretation. And the third interpretation, also found amongst the Mufassirin, and Imam Maturidi mentions this interpretation, is that sulb and tara'ib are what we call linguistic indicators. Sulb refers to the man, tara'ib refers to the woman, and in their communion, this liquid is ejaculated. So that's what he's talking about. It's a very metaphorical understanding of Imam Maturidi. And these were given, remember, the important thing about all of these interpretations, they were given before modern science came and pinpointed any of these things. So these are all original, authentic interpretations of Quran that were not done in order to circumvent a contradiction. They were done as tafsir of the Quran. And we're using those three tafasir. So any one of these three. And for further detail, again, just Google Sapiens Institute and Surah 86 verse 7. And the full, I think it's about a half an hour video, there's even a longer one, where they explain it all in detail with the references. Obviously, we don't have time to do that. So I think we'll stop there. And these three generally you'll find as your main contradictions that you're going to talk about. Allah, Allah. الحميد المجيد الرشيد الشهيد اللطيف